So, Resident Evil 7, Capcom. What's going on, everybody? It's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and before we get into it, I will say this video is going to be a little bit strange. It's going to be a little bit rambly. It's going to be a little bit probably backtracking over the same things over and over again, because I am very tired, and this is a very, very strange situation. So, Resident Evil 7, that game that launched last year on Xbox One, PS4 and PC. Decent game. After I played through it the first time, I was really enjoying it, but then over the course of the next week or so, I kind of burned out a little bit and the hype died down and I looked at it for what it was. Still a decent game, mind you. But anyway, it's finally coming to the Nintendo Switch next week in a very peculiar way, shape and form. So what's actually coming out is what's called Resident Evil 7 Cloud Edition. Now, there's a bunch of caveats on this as well, which we'll get to in a second. But before we go any further, it is the Game of the Year edition, if you will. Or I think they call it the Gold Edition in Resident Evil 7's case. It comes with all the DLC, all the Season Pass stuff, as well as the free update for the Chris update with the Not a Hero thing. So it has all of those in there as well. So it's essentially the whole game and all the available DLC, both free and paid. Now, here's where it starts to get very strange. First off, this is only announced for Japan as it is at the moment. There's probably a reason for this, which we'll get to now in a minute, but on top of that, since it's called the Cloud Edition, this game does not have a physical version, it does not have a fully contained digital download version. This game is 100% streamed from the cloud. So what that means is this game, this Resident Evil 7, is run on a server somewhere. So it's going to be running at like PC, high max settings, blah blah blah. And it is completely streamed, every asset and every facet. Wow, those words actually rhyme. But all of those functions and features will be streamed from the server through the internet onto the Nintendo Switch. Because, let's face it, the Nintendo Switch probably can't run this game. Now, I know someone's already reaching for the comment section going, oh, Skyrim, Doom, Wolfenstein, it can run it. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. I'm gonna lean with maybe it can't. But that's beside my actual point that I'm trying to make here. So let's go back to the actual Switch version of it here, or the cloud version. So because this is 100% streamed at all times, of course, naturally, you do need an internet connection at all times in order to play this. Because if you don't have an internet connection, you can't stream anything from the server. Which ties back into something I said a minute ago, which was the fact that it's only announced for Japan at the moment, which makes sense because their country is a lot smaller than many other countries around the world, and their internet and their infrastructure is actually very, very good from what I understand. Meaning, unless you're in a hotel or you're in the middle of nowhere out in the countryside, you're basically guaranteed low latency, high speed internet. So it makes sense why it's kind of targeted just at Japan at the moment. I will say this too, the game or service of the game or whatever it is actually comes with a 15-minute free trial. So you can try out the whole thing, and if you do like it, you can spend 2,000 yen, which is about $20, €20 for the purpose of this video. And you get 180 days access to Resident Evil 7 Cloud Edition and all its DLC. Now, believe it or not, even though I've talked for nearly 5 minutes about this whole situation, I'm not actually really here to talk about Resident Evil 7 Cloud Edition. I just wanted to fill in and inform people on the details of everything about this so they can understand my next point I'm about to make, which is the Nintendo Switch and yet another shortcoming of the Nintendo Switch. So let's look at it this way. Could Resident Evil 7 possibly run on Nintendo Switch? Maybe. If they severely drop down the resolution, probably to sub HD or threw in a dynamic resolution at a really low baseline, if you will, completely gimp back all the textures, the lighting, the shadow, everything, and of course cut the frame rate in half or below, yes, it could potentially run on Nintendo Switch. Potentially, because I don't know the 100% ins and out of the Resident Evil engine, since I'm not a game developer. But I do understand the basics and the kind of outline for game engines and how they work, specifically their scalability. But that's not the point I want to make here. The point I do want to make is when you look at the Nintendo Switch and several design choices that Nintendo made when designing the Nintendo Switch and partner with Nvidia for it, you have maybe 4 or 5 very big things to consider. Number 1, power. There is an absolute limit and a finite limit for measurable power. We all know the base Xbox One is slightly below the base PS4, and the Nintendo Switch is about 3/4 of the power of an Xbox One. These are all finite, measurable numbers, people. It is 100% fact. And of course the PC is miles ahead of all of these. Now, I'm not just bragging about the power of that, it'll make more sense now in a second. So when you see the power side of it, Nintendo was already at a serious disadvantage. And then you take something else into the equation as well that Nintendo probably didn't really factor in and just tried to damage control around it. And that is architecture. So not only is the Nintendo Switch far behind when it comes to power, but it's also one of the only 4 platforms that doesn't use the same architecture. Which means games do need to be ported across a bit more in depth than between regular systems. For example, just because the Xbox One, PS4 and PC all use the same architecture, it's not just a copy, paste, drag and drop. There are some very small and minor changes that need to be done, but when you compare what needs to be done to the Nintendo Switch version, that's a whole other story. Point number 3, severely inadequate internal storage. That one speaks for itself, so I don't even need to elaborate on it. And number 4, a very backwards and convoluted and prohibitive storage media and licensing system. All of these come together to create a very big and very real and present issue. And this is something you can see every time you look at the Nintendo Switch library. Third-party support. Now, granted, third-party support is something Nintendo hasn't done correctly in about 20 years. Ever since the Super Nintendo, they haven't been able to do it right. In the N64 days, you had companies running from the more powerful N64 to the PlayStation 1 because it was a CD-based system. The CDs on the PlayStation were over 10 times larger capacity than even the largest Nintendo 64 cartridge. Move on to the GameCube, same deal. 1.4GB mini DVDs versus other companies that were using 4.5 and 9GB DVDs. I know someone's going to bring up Sega and their 1GB GD-ROMs, but you see my point, we all know how that ended. The Wii, enough said, standard definition, couldn't run the games. Wii U had the storage because when you're looking at the Blu-ray discs, the 25GB ones that the Wii U actually used, but again, power and different architecture. And now we're on to Nintendo Switch and the cycle repeats. Because here's how this works. As a console manufacturer, you are not obligated to third-party support. You want to court these companies to bring their games to your console. You want to make compromise. You want to work with them. You want to offer them an attractive, easy to do, easy to use, easy to develop for a platform for them to put their games on. Let's go back a minute to where I said potentially that Resident Evil 7 could run on Nintendo Switch. Maybe, like I said, if you cut down the resolution, maybe even put it in dynamic, completely severely drop down the textures, lighting, shadows, etc., and not to mention cut the frame rate in half. First off, let's look at how much of a drastic change would need to be done to a game, just all I listed, just to get it onto the Switch, unacceptable as it is in my opinion. But that's a lot of changes and a lot of work that needs to be done, especially by a company when they have to port it to a different architecture. So because Nintendo has done all this and they've designed all this around the architecture and the power and whatnot, companies may not want to bother, which could potentially be the case in this one. But that's a failing on Nintendo's side. That means they have failed to attract a third-party support in this particular case, as well as many others, but we're looking at this one. Because if a company looks at it this way and they say, well, we can release on these 3 bigger platforms with very little adjustments, very little changes, work, and more importantly, cost to actually develop these versions, versus the Nintendo Switch, where we have to put in considerably more man hours to port it over, cut down everything. Yeah, I can understand why they don't do this. And because on the cloud services hardware, it's just going to be the PC running a game that already exists, they won't need to put in extra money, extra development costs, extra development resources, anything like that into developing a Nintendo Switch port, because they're just going to use the PC one. So you can form your own opinion on this, and you can decide if this is a good thing or a bad thing by weighing the pros and the cons. You can ask yourself, is this a good thing that we're getting more games, even if they are unfortunately cloud streamed, that you're now getting games that wouldn't normally run on the console? Because for all we know, Capcom or other companies could do this with other games too. Do you think this will ever release outside of Japan in a service like this? Because let's face it, PlayStation Now, not very good. Latency is latency is latency is latency. And then you can look at it in the other way and just call Capcom lazy. And chances are this is the last time I'm actually going to speak about something like this, because frankly I've beaten it to death. It's gone over and over and over, it's happened over and over and over, and it's going to keep happening over and over and over, where all the stuff I just mentioned is going to cause whatever to not come to the Nintendo Switch, be it power, architecture, or because of all of that, companies making the decision that it's not financially viable. Granted, this situation was a little bit different, so unless something really weird or super different or crazy happens in the future, then I might talk about it. But at this point, it's dead. Just before we end out the video, I'm going to ask you guys, Do you have any interest in this? Do you think it's a good thing? It's a bad thing? Would you try something like this out if it ever released outside of Japan? And do you think we'll see more games like this, possibly from Capcom or other developers and publishers in the future using services like this? Anyway, let me know all that good stuff in the comments section below. Hit the appropriate button to let me know how I did on the video. And while you're at it, why not subscribe just because? And even turn on the notification bell. Granted, YouTube probably still won't send you all the updates and live stream notifications. But hey, at least you can say you tried, right? Anyway, as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the rest of the videos in my channel.